Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our first lecture of the Architecture Lecture Series. Did you like our little video clip from the poster? As I said, the poster was designed by Bob Offeldish and Andrew Cudless on our faculty. Also worked with him on this, and we've decided to do these little video clips in advance. So it's with great pleasure that I'm able to welcome Theo Spyropoulos to CCA and introduce him this evening. Perhaps this is a prelude to the Acadia conference that we're hosting this fall that Jason Johnson is chairing, and I want to thank Jason for being in touch with Theo about this. Theo is an architect and an educator. He's a co-founder with his brother of Minimaforms, an experimental interdisciplinary architecture and design practice that focuses on architecture, interactive installations, interface design, and product and web design, crossing many of the boundaries and beyond the boundaries of traditional practice. Minimaforms has worked for a range of clients and has produced work that has been extensively published and exhibited at many international venues. And these have included the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the ICA in London, the Futura Gallery in Prague, the Slovak National Gallery in Bratislava, the UK Architecture Foundation, as well as many galleries in Spain, Sydney, Greece, Italy, and also Germany. The work of the studio has also been acquired by the Flack Center in France, the Signum Foundation in Poland, and the Archigram Archive in the UK. Recent projects of the studio include a series of thematic landmarks for the Renzo Piano Master Plan, National Park in Athens, a large-scale work of land art in Norway, a collaboration with the activist artist Christoph Wodisko, and an immersive and ethereal environmental installation called Memory Cloud for the city of Detroit. Theo received his B.Arch from NJIT, his Master of Architecture from the Architectural Association, and is also a PhD candidate at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College in London. In addition to his professional work leading Minimaforms, Theo has also worked as a project architect and designer for HOK Sport in London, for Jardi Architects, Zaha Hadid, and Eisenman Architects. As an educator and as a researcher, Theo is the director of the Architectural Association's Innovative Design Research Lab in London. He has taught at the AA since 2002 and has also been a research fellow at MIT's Center for Advanced Visual Studies, working with the Interrogative Design Group, and he's also co-founded the new Media Research Initiative at the AA. He has also been a visiting professor or instructor at Penn Design and at the Royal College of Art in the Innovation Design Engineering Department. Please join me in welcoming Theo Spyropoulos.
Thanks, Isla, and thanks, Jason and Natalie, for the very kind invitation and introduction. I think in terms of the subject of the talk today, I basically wanted to take a moment and share some of the work that we've been doing and evolving between my brother and myself under Minimaforms, and also with my colleagues at the AA at the Design Research Lab. Being that you guys will be hosting Acadia here and a whole series of other issues that are sort of teased out when one starts to understand the complexities and the issues at hand when one is trying to think about experimental forms of practice and what that actually means in a more contemporary sense of that. I think it's been pretty critical in, let's say, my own development. That I've had the opportunity to be teaching and working at the same time in an environment like London, which is quite international and in a certain sense very diverse. So a lot of the influences that I have are as much from the scene in London as the students that come to work with us at the AA, and with the more interdisciplinary kind of collaborations that I've been fortunate to have with my brother and with other artists. So the subject of the conversation is going to kind of straddle a kind of host of different kinds of conditions. I'm interested in a sense of trying to tease out what some of that stuff is, very much influenced by cybernetics, art, architecture, and design. At the same time, very much also interested in computation and what that actually affords architecture and design discipline in general. At the AA, we've been really trying to understand, let's say, kind of what contemporary forms of practice could actually offer. The role of the prototype, for example, in architecture is something that we would like to desire, but the truth of the matter is, in practice, the prototype or the prototypical is something that the strain of practice and the economy and so forth doesn't really allow for much of this kind of much more experimental research to take place. So the role of schools and academics in particular really become laboratories and in a sense embrace, I think, the ethos of trying to innovate, to test, to embrace the notion of failure and also to push the discipline forward. At the Design Research Lab, we work in collective teams. It's a team-based kind of program. We've been working for the last 3 or 4 years on something that we've been calling Proto Design, which is really trying to understand what behavior, both social and material forms of interaction, what that kind of affords a certain kind of attitude towards design today. So for me, collective design is really an important thing. I like to share this idea of participatory models because I think they allow for a kind of educational framework that is really about trying to construct a framework and an environment where the way knowledge is actually transferred is as much from teacher to student as it is from student to student. We all share the discipline or the desire and a kind of optimism to think that architecture and design matters, and I think that's one of the virtues of the AA is the fact that most people that come there really believe that we can make a difference, and to set up a kind of environment to allow that to foster, I think, is part of my job as a director. And for the last 11 years, I've been involved in different capacities at the AA, and the AA, in a sense, is a series of Georgian terrace houses. We don't have an amazing facility of any sense. We have no space, but we have a lot of interest, and we kind of want to do stuff. The one thing that's changed a little bit, the culture of the AA, which has a strong, I think, discipline in terms of making as a form of thinking, is acquiring a 300-acre site outside of London called Hook Park. This is, I think, one of those places. It's a Fry Auto designed building. It's a former chair factory. It's afforded a kind of different sensibility at the AA, not just in the DRL, but generally with people like Martin Self in the Design Make program and others. And the sense of actually trying to take architecture beyond the walls of the AA and even just across the street. We had the opportunity with our 10th anniversary to do a design build of a pavilion with familiar techniques that we all use, but the complexities of what architecture demands as a kind of learning tool. We don't get those opportunities all the time to have sponsorship, like Reader, who gave us basically something to the effect of £200,000 worth of material. Sometimes we only have £300, and at the same time we still have to try to make something happen. This is a 4-day workshop that I run with the incoming students in that Hook Park facility. Throughout the time that I've been at the AA, there's been this kind of coupling about trying to understand how new technologies, and sometimes they're pretty old technologies, but new to us, could start to challenge our kind of notions of what the drawing is, what interaction is, how do we facilitate new forms of communication. And in many ways, we try to use, the most basic and primitive of senses, installations, exhibitions, try to participate in publications, though the DRL isn't the best at that. We do like to create a lot of work, and that work, in a sense, I think is part of an active dialogue that we have with each other. Like I said, it's structured with students working in groups of 3 or 4, and I think this is kind of really important because their backgrounds are quite varied. And for me, I think a lot of the things that I've tried to bring to the DRL somehow has a certain kind of lineage for me, which is very important, and it stems from the mid-60s, I think, till the mid-70s, where you got radical kind of experiments and kind of setting up kind of constructs in which one person and a group could actually sit down and try to foster a kind of scenario that would really cut through the sort of conventions of what we knew in terms of discipline and disciplinary action. So for example, something like Experiments for Art and Technology, EAT, you have someone like Robert Rauschenberg and Billy Kluver, figures like Bob Whitman coming together, trying to really understand the difference between art and engineering, and then thinking that maybe it's not a bad idea to try to experiment within those frameworks. Those frameworks, I think, are quite interesting because I think between design, engineering, science, we're finding ourselves, I think, in a very unique moment in time where I actually do think like it's pretty radical in all senses. The 60s, I think, was very much about the kind of techno-optimism. There was a lot of trial and error making, and there was a lot of, let's say, goodwill in terms of what that actually suggests. Today is a little bit different. I think we all sort of understand that, and I think also the, let's say, the leash that we have to actually experiment, to try things is always overly judged quite quickly. But within the domain of computation and architecture, it's an experiment that's being evolved over the last 30, 40 years in let's call it, more hardcore practices. And through that, I think this isn't about digital design, but this is really about trying to discover what are the differences of different approaches and methodologies within that. And I think in the DRL at the moment, we are trying to sort of cultivate that between generative approaches, behavioral ones, parametric ones, and more analog material computational forms. And this has a history in terms of experimentation, in terms of what architecture's role would be in sort of constructing new forms of knowledge. I sort of show this as my sort of go-to slide when I try to explain that architecture has an amazing influence. This is Negroponte at the MIT, where he set up the Architecture Machine Group, which is now formally, well, now is known as the MIT Media Lab. The questions of architecture became fundamental. The way that we work and develop and move through materials also has a certain kind of form of experimentation, which I think is a kind of serious play. And with that, I think we start to discover a whole different set of problems and questions about the role of technology, its interaction or relationship to the human, its capacity to actually rethink our sort of conventions and understanding of the world and each other. So when I say that I have an interest in art and cybernetics and so forth, I think a lot of the experiments that I think are most striking to me have come really through people that actually really didn't give a shit about what they were called, but actually were really fostering and allowing the project to actually evolve and to take shape. And for example, in a project like this, it's one of the first cybernetic sculptures by Edward Anatovich. This is down the street from the AA at UCL. He was a kind of part engineer, part artist, but mostly interested in actually evolving different kinds of attitudes towards human interaction. And Phillips gave him an opportunity to create this as part of his Avalon experimental museum. And he created the first kind of interactive robot. It possessed lifelike kind of features, and it enabled a certain kind of form of participation, which I think was beyond novel. It actually lost the boundary or the division of animate and inanimate kind of interaction. And Negroponte, I think, really tries to give a sense of what all of these things could actually mean, because he articulates it as a problem between an association of different species, which he calls man and machine, and different intelligence systems, which he calls the architect and the architecture machine. A lot of the work that we try to do is also trying to be a bit speculative. It's, in a sense, acknowledging the fact that there are things that are latent and there are things that are unknown. So within the discourse and within the practice of actually designing systems, how does one sort of foster the ability for allowing a system to demonstrate a kind of intelligence? Negroponte talked about it. A lot of people did in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but they didn't necessarily have access to the stuff. Someone like John Fraser would say people were computing without computers because the ideas were there, the sensibility and the speculation were fostered, but not necessarily did they have the access to it. I think if we fast forward to 2012, I'd like to think that we actually do have a lot of the capacity to enable a lot of these kind of projects. I think, though, we do have to focus on the nature of the project and less about the sensibilities of the tools at hand today. So, for example, this is Walter Gray Walter studying the brain by creating a couple of mechanical agents that would interact with each other and start to learn from their environment and respond to each other. This is a kind of experiment into robotics. I think it's something that a lot of us are interested in, but what it is that interests us, I think, is something that needs to be teased out, and for what purpose. When you start to see a lot of the discourse about how these things are evolving, you can see today something like at ETH, Raffaello, working with quadricopters and starting to articulate a different kind of relationship where robots could actually be participatory. They could participate with people, but they don't really need us either. What I think is really interesting is not to think about the fact that a lot of this kind of stuff is just gadgets and toys, but it begins to start to talk about a very different kind of ecology between machines and how they can sort of contribute and participate to our everyday. What's interesting at the AA is it also has obviously a history, and its history is kind of coupled by different characters who've been working on the problem. And someone like John Fraser was one of the characters who's maybe most known at the AA for doing that, as he was working with people like Cedric Price and Gordon Pascoe as a cybernetician, developing a certain attitude towards evolutionary architecture, which in a certain sense didn't actually have an author in a conventional form. The discussions and the sort of teasing out of an idea of an environment was something that was really interesting and remains interesting to me. And I'd like to thank to my students, but you can ask them later. You have people like Carl Sims in the 90s who was also talking about the fact that instead of just designing algorithmic forms and sort of designing codes that would recursively iterate, how could one evolve sort of features, and how can we don't have to play God in design, a kind of total design top-down, but to allow different forms of interaction to enable things. And here Mr. Sims is talking about how these creatures start to develop different appendages and so forth, and in a certain sense evolve their own sort of formations. So a lot of these things I think are really interesting, but beyond interest, I think they start to change our sensibility about how we think about space, environment, and what role the new techniques and tools could actually start to contribute. This is a project by one of our student groups in Alyssa Andershek's studio, Probotics. And it was one of those projects that was using agency about 4 or 5 years ago to develop a kind of an attitude towards interaction between things. I mean, this was our early days of serious play, I guess, in processing. These things kind of evolve, I think, different discourses, and I think those discourses are interesting because they, within certain practices, remain within the digital, and in other practices are starting to move into more tangible media, let's call it, let's say, responsive environments. Our students, what I find really interesting is when you sort of create a framework that allows them to openly question their own sort of trajectory within a certain kind of umbrella agenda, a lot of different aspects and tools begin to become important to sort of discover, and curiosity is not only fostered, but it becomes the real driving agency in terms of how we work on some of the projects that we do. And obviously we are architects, so we are pretty much amateur, let's call it interaction designers, amateur mechanists. We have an interest in a lot of things, and if we have the desire to explore them, I think some interesting results actually happen from that. So in the studio, a lot of the things are kind of experiments, and experiments foster further experiments, and that's where this idea of a kind of serious form of interrogation starts to get formalized. So from novelty of an interest of a group of students into something, it becomes formalized by asking different kinds of research questions that start to articulate different problems that they're looking at and different paths. If you ask some of the students who've come to me and they've been studying with us, if they were going to try to make mechanical pets or if they were going to be trying to shoot particles into space. I mean, they wouldn't have that kind of sensibility. But in the end, I mean, they're the ones that are actually authoring some of these projects. And what's interesting about these projects is I think they do tie into this kind of history that I was trying to explain of people like Brayton's vehicles, who was also looking at how simple agent-based systems could actually not only foster different kinds of interactions, which are sort of talked about by people like John Holland and a whole series of other computational discourses, but through those interactions also have emotive features that people would be responding to. And so Brayton talked about certain forms of interaction would describe things as showing emotions that could be like love or hate. And they become really interesting for me because that sensibility opens up a different kind of relationship in terms of how we communicate within architecture. And interaction, intelligence, and experience becomes a very important feature. I think when someone tries to operate and to work within that, the scope of issues and parameters are really wide. But the one thing that I think is something that we try to maintain continuously is to really consider making as a form of thinking. And with that, to shift from this kind of attitude of representation into something that actually demands a certain form of prototypical nature. This has been, I think, a very critical moment in terms of how our own course and our own interest, not only within the course, but also with myself and with the people that we work on, is this role of the prototype in testing, where we start to use simple everyday materials and try to understand the dynamics at play when we really want to embrace a kind of attitude towards the world which isn't fixed and finite, but is actually something that's dynamic, evolving, or possibly even adaptive. Part of that is also an understanding that materiality isn't something that's inert. Materiality does have lifelike properties. It does have phase change properties, life cycles. It's not something that's a given, and those things transform over time and are dictated by rules and parameters just like everything else that we do. And sometimes these very kind of primitive first step experiments of just playing with some of these things start to foster, I think, a very different sensibility because they already start to question, let's say, the conditioned attitude of what we know as the conventions of materiality within architecture, or at least the ones that are familiar and known in the everyday. And then when we start to sort of operate within these kind of issues of phase changing and logic, we start to try to find ways of control, but this is a really different sensibility of control. This isn't command and control that we're trying to dominate, we're just trying to participate, because the materials in a sense have their own behaviors, and if we don't acknowledge them, then we really can't use them. And as I was mentioning, the AA isn't a place that is super high-tech. If anybody has visited, you'll know that we just got a couple of laser cutters and the CNC machine as of 5-6 years ago. So a lot of the things are also hack jobs in terms of actually using those machines in themselves, and sometimes fostering relationships with outside consultants that could help us push the work forward. On the left is a project by a group of students who were working with Festo and Martha Malay's studio. On the right is a flexible formwork workshop that I do with my first-year students. And part of also that kind of acknowledgement is also understanding that there's a history of sort of characters and figures that try to create and foster these environments. One of the things that's absolutely critical, I think, is a kind of acknowledgement of how limited and how few examples we actually have of people that have had the conviction to work through a project that spans beyond a couple of years, you know. So people like Fry Otto for us is a really important figure, and his institute, I think, is also something that doesn't directly influence us in the literal sense that we try to mimic what he was doing. But I think in terms of the sensibility of experimentation and the range of experiments that dealt with all kinds of materialities, I think it is and remains, I think, a very important example for us. And that example, I think, is important because I think it's not just about discussing the issues of material computation, it's also exploring the idea that models could be instruments for design. And these kind of more matrix-like setups of trying to really understand how an erection process within a structure could start to be explored, understood, and developed. And these material experiments, or these analog forms of computation, also serve a role in terms of how we think and dynamically try to create an active feedback between the digital and the analog. So these characters actually offer us a lot in terms of understanding, I think, somehow what we're doing today and the economy and the means that they've worked with, or the limitations of things like Eladio Dieste, Candela, and so forth. What's also interesting, I think, today is also to understand that they also had a very socially motivated project. If you can see that Dieste was basically designing factories and gas station canopies, but still making them actually important. And part of that reason was because he actually felt that architecture and engineering had something to contribute at all stages. So his house of God, like a church or a factory, was still conditioned with a certain attitude towards the human and the people. And it's not just to try to pretend like we're good people, it's about actually really trying to implement a certain idea that architecture and working through materialities and certain forms of, let's say, constraints or correlations could create a kind of architecture that would open itself up to different laws of correlation. So experimentation, research, the pursuit of the novel, material, and social forms of systemic interaction conditions, I think, a lot of the things that we develop. And part of that, I think it's always really important to understand other people who are, let's say, your friends in this research. Someone like Thomas Edison was developing a logic of a single-pore house. On the right is our students from Anon who are in my studio, and we're developing also a logic of flexible formwork for the development of a single-pore house as well. You see in contemporary media, when we start to talk about 3D printing and all of this stuff, you have someone like Kushnevitz on the left and contour crafting talking about printing a house or making a house in a day. That same sensibility of Edison is still the same sensibility that we maintain. So I think at the end of the day, if this highlights anything, is to understand that the nature of the architectural problem is really the nature of the problem. And the tools and the techniques and the things that are afforded are obviously things that are evolving. But I think the issue of actually what constitutes a house, for example, in this is probably the thing that becomes more fundamental and sometimes least questioned. So as we start to really look into a lot of these kind of conditions, we try to create environments that allows for a kind of dynamic interaction. We try to extract these principles and sensibilities, especially from a lot of these masters who have a lot to offer us, and try to then think about how interaction and different forms of sort of coupling could allow these kind of systems to evolve different features. We've had an ongoing interest in flexible formwork and soft cast systems, soft systems in general, and we've been developing a logic about how that could actually be enacted in and within the discipline, looking at textile engineering as a sort of facilitator of rethinking the notion of actually what reinforcement could be, what the deployment sensibility could be, and the transition or the transformation of something that could be a tensile, lightweight structure into something that is a cast, load-bearing structure. These are different experiments that we do within Hook Park, also in the first term. To suggest that this only operates at the scale of the prototype, I think, is something that would be misinformed from my side to communicate on that level. But I think the challenges of actually trying to understand the differences of scale or what a polyscalar relationship between computation would be is also a challenge. So if you looked at a lot of the visionary urban experiments, the vision or the utopian logic is always maintained, but the attitude in terms of how that could actually be manifested through duration and time were the things that became a problem within that discourse. So here as well, Frei Otto with his kind of experiments, we start to try to understand those experiments with a kind of time-based attitude towards that, so that we have a sensibility within the digital where we can sort of acknowledge and also deal with a very different form of resolution And so the things that have been generalized principles that people have been talking about, or things that are becoming almost cliche when one speaks about computation and architecture, could be rediscovered through the digital platforms and through the behavioral platforms that we are sort of operating within. And part of that is also to try to understand the differences about our kind of informed decision-making. The role of actually iterating or developing a sort of process that gives us multiple options is not so much that we create lots and lots of options, but we try to find ways of understanding better a kind of fitness criteria that will allow us to develop and understand buildings in their complexity. And for the last, before we were working on Proto Design, we had an agenda called Parametric Urbanism, which was trying to actually straddle 3 different scales at the same time. We managed 2 of those 3 scales between building and urbanism, and at the same time, that scared people. And it scared people because of the idea that many people thought that we were trying to develop almost like an idea of thinking of the city as a building, because they focused a lot in terms of not so much the rules and the protocol of what we were trying to develop, which at least tried to acknowledge the magnitude and the degree of the complexity of these problems, but we're focusing more on the kind of imagery of the final building designs, which they thought had a very familiar kind of response to a lot of the projects, like in the metabolist period and others. And I think one of the things that we have to actually, I think, acknowledge and start to work on is to try to be able to better communicate with each other about what it is that we're actually looking at and how do we place value and judgment on that. Mostly because I actually feel like if you do accept a sort of research and a collective way of thinking about things, then you realize that that doesn't reside within a institution, but it is a collective project, and with that we need to do things in which we can actually work together, communicate together, and actually try to foster a different level of conversation than the trivial ones that we usually have. So for example, things like termite ecologies, different aspects could actually foster a different sensibility of housing. And it's not to suggest that that by itself is limited to that capacity, but if you actually dig deeper and you start to see how that has spawned a whole different attitude in terms of thinking about swarm robotics and different sort of deposition strategies, you start to see that there's a culture of people, not necessarily architects, who are interested in these kind of modes of thinking and also are trying actively to work and to develop certain technologies to kind of operate within that. Maybe I'll shift a little bit into maybe some of the stuff that I do with my brother, but maybe this slide isn't a bad one to end on, which is Frank Lloyd Wright, which I guess some people know. Frank Lloyd Wright's a really interesting character because I think this image for me summarizes a lot of things about the divide between what one person would constitute what's acceptable within architecture and what's not. He had many visionary plans, things like Broadacre City and so forth. If you look at this image long enough, you realize that there are some pretty crazy vehicles in there. So these are his cars that he designed as ways of moving through the infrastructure of the cities that he was trying to develop. And he can design these kind of space-aged bubbles with big wheels and all of that stuff, but at the same time, he preconditions his idea of what the house is within a certain kind of language and vocabulary which he's established. And I find that this image is kind of symptomatic of how we actually treat architecture today. It's becoming actually very academic in terms of the way that we try to actually foster a conversation with ourselves and the kinds of experimentation and ideas towards research that we actually implement. Every studio is a research studio. The distinction between design and research is coupled, but to be honest with you, when we set up the course and we had to get evaluation, when we said that design was a form of research and made a name like the DRL and thought about the studio and substituted a word as laboratory, it caused all kinds of problems. I'm not necessarily saying that it's a laboratory in any sense of the manner, but what I'm saying is that those terms actually need to be reevaluated I think, at every given moment to try to understand and give clarity of actually what we're talking about. And with that, maybe I'll sort of give a little bit of a prelude into some of the work that we've been doing in minimaforms. And then we could probably open it up to some questions, which I'm sure some people may have. In parallel to when I moved to London and my brother moved to study at a school called Central St. Martin's, he's not an architect. He studied topography, art, and communication design. We were really interested in trying to find a way to work together because we were both not really satisfied with the kinds of questions that we were doing within practice. So in parallel to teaching, we were working in different offices, and there were a lot of questions that we had about a host of different issues, but mostly about how architecture could, and if it could, reinstate a different form of communication that would enable people, would construct sort of environments that would allow people to participate, that sort of take on board certain attitudes that maybe Cedric Price was trying to articulate in projects like the Fun Palace, and to try to understand what that could actually mean within the practice of the tools, the techniques, the methodologies that we were actually developing with our students, but also within our different disciplines. One of the projects that was probably the most fundamental rethinking for both of us was a project that we called Memory Cloud. It changed a lot of the things because we were given an opportunity to basically create a kind of artificial cloud made of fog. We talked about it because we thought like this would be a way to foster a kind of dialogue and interaction that was something that's not a part of typography, and for sure it wasn't a part of architecture in a conventional sense, which is how could we construct an environment that would be spatialized and would operate as a way to enable the general public to communicate. And this project actually had twofold problematic. One was this notion of elemental uncertainty, which was actually talking about an architecture of atmosphere. And the other one was actually enabling people with the means or the interface to allow them to participate in something without stifling them. And I'll talk a little bit about the project. I'll show a video afterwards, but this theme became a really important feature in us. Another aspect was opportunities that we had working with people like David Green. For those who don't know who David Green is one of the founding members of a radical British group called Archigram. From the beginning, he's always kind of challenged us to rethink certain sort of features of things. He's a guy who, at the height of his career, after doing a very famous project called the Living Pod, basically said that this was his last project in the domain, or the foray, he said, of shape making. And though he loves architecture, he, like Negroponte or these kind of figures, had a very particular project that actually led them away from architecture. And so David ended up working with people like Paul Smith, who was a fashion designer in Britain, but always actively continued as a teacher in architecture. And so through rethinking a lot of those kind of megastructural projects, that was something that was a very interesting thing about how we can reconstruct and rethink the notion of infrastructure within architecture itself. Someone else who has been actually really important to us is Krzysztof Wodicko. Aside of having a great deal of respect for Krzysztof, who is a social and political, you'd like to say activist artist. I don't know if you would abide by my description of it, but he is a very interesting figure because he actually engages people and engages issues that are not necessarily the most comfortable, and for sure are not necessarily the most, let's say, easy to absorb in the domain of the public space in which he actually operates within. He's known as a projection artist, and he's also known for doing projects like the homeless vehicle. We had the luxury of working with him for 4 years on a project constructing a vehicle. I called it a think weapon, which was actually working with veterans who were coming back from the Iraq War and developing and using design as a way to actually communicate about a whole host of different issues that were resulting from issues to deal with trauma. The project itself is more an instrument of acknowledging that design actually fosters a certain form of communication than it was actually a design of a vehicle in itself. And that, for me, actually opened up a whole series of different issues and an interest, I think, with my brother Stephen about how we could try to foster different kinds of environments to enable people to participate and just to allow that to open up a different kind of attitude towards their contribution to it. And part of that reason is that we make a real distinction between things that are reactive and interactive. Reactive is really things that operate within the novel. It keeps your attention span for maybe a couple of seconds. Something that's truly interactive actually is asking something from you, you're contributing something, it gives you something back, and it has the possibility to foster what something like Gordon Pask would argue as a form of conversational practice. What's interesting for me about cybernetics, or at least revisiting the British form of second-order cybernetics, is the idea that conversation would be a systemic practice, and the idea that it doesn't have to start with any prefigured or predetermined kind of attitude towards things, and it can stop and start within the duration of whatever that conversation will be. But it is a kind of very open system that allows and affords a certain kind of knowledge. And I think this has been really interesting for us because we've been, with my brother, always involved in certain kinds of electronic music and these kind of more event-based opportunities that people have asked us to do an installation, sometimes for 2 hours, sometimes for 3 days. But we've always sort of used those kind of opportunities to engage a small community. It could be as small as 50 or 60 people or as large as 800 or 1,000 people. And those kind of things, I think, become really interesting because a lot of that language of thinking about architecture as an environment or rethinking certain notions of what event means in architecture for us has been something that we continuously revisit. And this kind of continues, and I think for some reason within a kind of discourse, which is a very particular kind of art discourse and architecture. For example, someone like the performance artist Stellark has been also a collaborator of ours. If you know Stellark, he has an ear on his arm, he does bio-art, robotics, he does a whole series of different kind of performances. He's known quite a lot for hanging himself with hooks. And in a strange way, he was invited to Brunel University to develop a kind of strategy. He was to rethink the campus and to introduce a form of art practice. Brunel University is named after the famous engineer. It has a technology school, but it also has a performance school. And the acknowledgement from Stellark's part was that sometimes art isn't always the answer. In this case, it was an intervention which he thought that architecture could probably participate more. And so the questions and the kind of concerns that people actually have with things become kind of open questions. We're generally not sort of commissioned off the bat. It's more like we have a conversation and we foster a relationship with people. And so ideas in this sense become something that become formalized and take on their own life within the discourse of each of the projects and the clients that we work with. And those things have actually unfolded, I think, a pretty interesting kind of conversation for us internally. I'll show you Memory Cloud in a second, but this idea of collective mirroring, I think, is something that's really important, which is it's the idea that people see themselves in the things that they're interacting with and they're participating with. It's more like holding up a mirror to a collective and actually allowing them to not only question themselves and their participation, but actually also listen to what other people actually have to say. I think maybe I'll just show the movie. Have I exhausted people with just talking? Not yet, right? Hopefully not. I don't have sound, so I'm just going to keep talking here, right? But the project was basically installed in Trafalgar Square. If people have been to London, Trafalgar Square is really the most public of squares. we were asked by the Institute of Contemporary Arts if we would develop an intervention within the public space. And we thought Trafalgar Square would probably be the most interesting of all spaces, because in London it sort of operates as the one space of communication that celebrates things as different kinds of holidays and those kind of more cultural events, to protests like May Day and so forth. It's a very particular kind of sense of space, which has always been a space that really engages people and brings people together. It's also the most trafficked part of town. It's dead center and in the center of London. And so we had to work with the Mayor of London, with the ICA, with the National Portrait Gallery for over a year to actually enable a project that would be there for 2.5 hours each night for 3 evenings. What I think becomes really interesting about that is, people think that installations are somehow temporary, and they are, but the nature of the conversation was very interesting for us, because this was the 3rd time that the square was given over for an event under the title of art. Woditzko was one of the first who did a public projection on the South African embassy of a swastika. And so you fast forwarded it to 2008 when we were being asked to do something, and a lot of time passed. And so art in that context is relegated to plinths or possibly an installation in the center, but relegated to a particular bounding box. What we were proposing was to create a kind of artificial cloud, and that cloud would be basically based on the concept of smoke signals, which is one of the oldest forms of visual communication. It's a 5,000-year-old practice. The caricature is a little Indian with a carpet over a fire. And couple that with SMS texting to allow people an interface that would be able to communicate the way that they felt like, with without having to publicly sort of make that contribution manifest. What's interesting also for us was the fact that the space around Trafalgar Square, the steps of the National Gallery, became a theater. People were interested in seeing what other people had to contribute. When we did it in the square, a lot of the initial messages were quite novel. I mean, people trying to put their name up in smoke. We created a system because we had to be able to deal with the Mayor of London, because there was a strong fear about riots. There was a strong fear of a whole series of religious issues. How do you create a situation in which you create a completely open communication platform that is collectively authored? We didn't actually write any of those. These are some sample messages. And we learned a lot from this project, because I think in a certain way it sort of challenged a lot of the things. We had to present to the Mayor of London how, let's put it this way. The ICA thought that the project would probably not get planning. Like, architects know what planning is. You kind of go and ask permission to do stuff, right? In this case, we were asking to create a cloud, and the mayor basically wanted to know, because it was the most trafficked area, how would you define a cloud? And we made a circle. We made another circle, which is basically the dissipation rate. And as long as we could basically calculate that from a particular proximity, which we knew from each of the machines, he was totally cool with it. No questions asked afterwards. Was it environmentally okay? Yes, check. And so the mayor was actually the person that was the easiest person to actually work with. The techs of, let's say, the ICA were slightly different. They thought that this kind of stuff doesn't work and won't work, and it's going to be a disaster. And so the sensibility of actually the conversations actually also opened up a very different idea of how people actually see and understand the work that we were doing. We were basically suggesting that we would create a place where people could communicate with each other within Trafalgar Square. This was the way that we were going to do it, and that was okay for them. What I'm saying is the fact that I think that we usually don't give credit to people in terms of being open to new things. I think one of the challenges that we actually have to have as designers is to be able to be enabled to speak the everyday and to really understand that that is actually our real resource. We don't create the things that we do for ourselves, or generally we don't in architecture. And if you acknowledge that fact, then I think it's our kind of obligation to try to find ways to work with people to make some things happen. The strange part about it is for the ICA itself, which was an institute that had some serious financial problems. We did this piece in October. It was followed by, in November, a Mexican artist named Rafael Lozano Hemmer. Those two events generated probably the most traffic that the ICA had had in a long time. Immediately after November, the head of the ICA basically said that the new media department was old school art and closed the department. He suggested that painting, drawing, and actually having a venue for music was actually contemporary. I'm not one to sort of argue any sort of disciplinary differences, but the fact that at the same time it drove the most people to a particular place and it became an event for the museum, it's the same time that they got a little bit scared about its own role and said that new media design, art, and technology was actually really old-fashioned. This is the same people that actually carry their iPhones and all other sort of cool features. And it's a kind of sort of contradiction that we are faced today, which has nothing to do about the nature of work. It has to do with a preconception of what people actually have. And I think this is also something that is really important for you guys to understand as students and practitioners, is that I think we have to actually not just take that as a given and sort of retreat from that, but sort of be really much more proactive in engaging people to really understand what these things mean. I mean, maybe I just throw up some slides in terms of, or maybe one other project that we're currently working on, which is called Petting Zoo. This is a prototype that we've been developing, which is trying to work within a similar language of interaction. But the interaction here is more about creating lifelike features like the Senster project that we showed. And this is just a prototype of a much larger project, which will be installed in July. But what we've been trying to do is to really try to find a way to allow people to engage in different forms. A lot of the projects that we do, if you've seen any of our work, like Face Breeder, you contribute your picture, it reconstructs portraits. Memory Cloud, you contribute different messages, and it sort of becomes part of a collective story. We called it a collective act of writing space. As we've moved through things, we've also tried to open up the discussion, not just in forms of ephemerality and direct communication that are more participatory in that form, but also to try to do certain kinds of experiments that just foster different kinds of behaviors that would be materialized by allowing people to have a kind of intimate engagement with things. These tentacle-like features are basically part of something that we're calling the petting zoo as a way of sort of stimulating certain kinds of interactions and engagements with basically an artificial installed ceiling within an architectural space. What becomes interesting when you start to think about what the materiality of this is, it's not really a robot. It's not really a piece of new media or projection. It uses the tools of a lot of these things, but we don't have a lot of money to prototype stuff, so we basically laser cut polypropylene and some puppeteering. But we try to speculate about thinking about what this kind of form of interaction would be, and we're trying to develop a system which becomes engaged and can communicate through movement and gesture, but also through sound and through light, construct bits of atmosphere by releasing atmospheres within certain forms of interaction. And this is something that we're working on in the studio, and maybe it's an interesting project to just kind of close on, because the same environment that some of these projects are being fostered in development in are the same environments that some of my students, not same. I mean, I'm building this in the studio. My students actually help me at times to do this stuff. Some of them are sitting in the audience and they're on screen right now. what I think is kind of really important is to understand that what I think is the most important feature of all of this stuff within the creative discourse is that we're a community, we're a shared community. We need to develop sort of projects that really actively engage people. I don't think that it's a desire to reside within a gallery. I actually really am not interested in galleries at all. But they create the opportunity for us to create work that are in a venue that people could publicly engage in. And we are obviously very humbled every time we actually get it, an opportunity to do that. But at the same time, we acknowledge the fact that I'm, and my brother are not so interested in remaining within, let's say, an art and architecture discourse in any shape or form. I think what we're trying to do is to try to open up things and to rethink a certain attitude towards the everyday. People who did that in the past, someone like the Eames are a very interesting sort of model for people because they could move through film, through furniture, through splints, and really acknowledge that the project was actually driving the research and not the kind of sensibility of a particular signature, but more a certain attitude in terms of a kind of response within what they were working with. And because things come to us in very strange ways, I mean, these things that we've been working on for the last 6, 7 years have formalized themselves into projects that have become much more large-scale and architectural, like the master plan in Athens and a project in Norway, which unfortunately I can't really show you because we're recording this. And I don't want to get in trouble too soon because I would like to get the chance to build one of these things. In the end, I think it becomes really important to think that those things are not just trivial. Those things are the form of practice. Sometimes people may recognize them, sometimes not. But I think for you guys, it's really critical that you just kind of keep going with them. And with that, if you evolve that, I think you'll develop your own sensibility and people will recognize it and give you an opportunity to do it. And if not, then at least you're going to be happy with what you're doing. And so my sort of little objective with this talk was just to really kind of say that, for me anyway, between teaching and practice, and as a student, as it was mentioned, as a PhD student, I don't really see much of a difference between all of them because I do really feel that that is much part of a community of design and research and art today. It shares that sensibility that I was saying, like the 60s and 70s had. The reasons that they were doing it may have been just for fun, who knows? I'm not that old. But I think it's important to understand that that sensibility drove a very important body of work, and I think today we have the opportunity actually to not only revisit that work, because I'm not the most nostalgic of people, but it's important to revisit that work to understand that there is an evolution of ideas that are there, and there are resources to you to actually think and situate yourself today. So with that, I'm going to stop. And if there are questions, happily answer.
I have a question about that kind of back and forth that you guys are trying to foster in a way, the kind of synthetic practice and synthetic teaching, synthetic design. Maybe it's more in a kind of a procedural question, just relative to how you're sort of structuring the DRL. Can you talk a little bit about the kinds of people you're bringing in to teach and the way that you're kind of structuring, the way that you're training designers? Because clearly there's something else sort of happening, and I'm just more curious about structurally how you're approaching it.
Yeah, my approach towards structuring the DRL is pretty simple. I try to foster diversity, and that sort of brings up certain challenges. We've had a history of actually being known as very technique-oriented people, very formal-oriented people, and we are in some form, but I don't think that that's the only form of thinking about things. So I try to bring in people that I think also have a very different sensibility. I mean, Patrick, who I've been teaching with for a long time, Schumacher, I mean, he has a very strong top-down kind of thinking of parametric design. Myself is much more behavioral interaction-based. I've had people like Martha Malay, who's coming to us with a very material and machinic form of agenda. I think the most important thing that I have to do personally is to try to foster a kind of discussion and a discourse. We try to internalize that by having 3 or 4 different voices that sort of go to battle in a productive way, and also learn from each other, because we try to meet as much as possible. Like every 2 weeks, we review all the students' work. The idea of collective teaching, collective design doesn't just reside in the fact that there are 3 or 4 students working together. So I think it's really important to try to create a framework to allow other people to do their thing. So I think that's probably the most important thing that I do. Outside of that, we try to develop research questions that are broad enough, you know, that sort of span as an umbrella over 3 or 4 years. Within that, if you think about the fact that you have groups of teams, 13 to 15 of them working on that together, after a 3-year cycle, 40 to 50 odd projects, I do think that we actually have something that we could give over to people as a form of research on a subject, which I think when you look at people like Fry Otto, what I find really amazing, I mean, he gets the credit for almost all of it, but actually there's an amazing group of people and working there. But the fact that they were creating these research documents, that they were fostering a certain kind of agenda within that framework, I think became really important to us, or it's important to me, and I think it's something that we try to do with our students. Our students make their own research documents. They become part of an accessible library within the AA when they're not stolen all the time. Not for anything else, but we're not like a publishing house. The students make 2 copies. We put one in the gallery, it goes, and we put one in the library, and sometimes it stays. But yeah, I think it's really important to also invite people and also to do things like this, where it's not about exposing the work, it's about trying to talk about it. I mean, I'm for sure not actually standing up here like some evangelist sort of preaching about this is the right way, this is our way. Now, and tomorrow maybe be something different, but I think there's a continuation of a certain kind of attitude towards design research, and I think experimentation is not for the sake of it. It's actually about really trying to construct alternative ways of thinking and approaching and actually developing architecture. And I'm not really sure what that word actually means today, but I'm sure it's not the same thing that it meant like 30 or 50 years ago.
You mentioned these research interests of 3 or 4 years from corporate fields and parametric urbanism, now Proto Design. So that's been going on for a few years. If you want to think about what the next 3 or 4 year research project might be,
yeah, probably, yeah. No, I mean, we are at that moment now, and actually I'm supposed to explain that to my colleagues and students when I go back. But since this is probably not going to go public before that anyway, I mean, we basically build on things that we've done. I think one of the things is, even if the agenda changes, it's really a change in certain feature of it, right? We went from something like responsive environments, which was very installation, reactive, kinetic architecture, into parametric urbanism. It kind of makes some people think that we just kind of shoot from the hip in terms of an agenda, but practically speaking, we were looking at computation and we wanted to shift scales. And at a certain time, there's also an acknowledgement of what's going on in the world, which at that time, a lot of our colleagues were being asked to develop cities as if they were buildings, with time frames that were amazingly complex for people to manage, or at least to manage with any sort of, let's say, what we would consider design discourse within that. And so we tried to use that as a sort of problematic that we thought we should try to participate in. It challenged us, and I think in a way that's an important feature to sort of escape our own comfort. We've been really, let's say, challenged recently within the domain of materiality. I think that was the thing that we've tried to highlight the last 3 or 4 years within a Proto Design agenda. How to develop architecture that wasn't context-specific, but that you could say would be context-aware and could have hyper-specific features computationally. that part I think we haven't really fully developed. The materials, the machinic qualities, those kind of aspects, the prototyping in the most literal sense, I think we've gone pretty far with. And so we're going to do what we didn't do very well, which is really try to figure out how this kind of social scenarios, or at least focusing more on the application aspect of it, could start to build from that kind of logic of materiality and making and try to foster different kinds of responses. I mean, we've had some, I think, quite interesting student groups, but collectively as a research within the domain of the social, I think we could try to really target some of those things. And part of that is also acknowledging that within this domain that we're trying to talk about, which at times doesn't have an amazing dependency towards infrastructure or talks about certain deployment strategies, there's a demand that architecture should actually be able to drive itself, in the sense that energy becomes a very important feature. Ways of actually doing things better in a much more low-tech way, on-site materiality, as actually being not a negotiation between, let's say, Western machinic operations, but actually looking or rethinking the logic between craft and local building development, coupled with, I think, the things that we're trying to explore today within robotics, CNC technologies, lightweight materials, etc. So that's the agenda. I mean, don't really have a name yet. It's either behavior or behavioral agency, who knows. The word, I think, doesn't really matter so much. It's really the motivation behind what are the features of that. And I think one thing that's really important is that even though we define a question, because we try to frame it like that, it gets refactored with every incoming class. I mean, the students are a very big part about where we go with the projects, because we are trying to really foster that kind of, and be open and receptive to basically where they're coming from and the knowledge that they're bringing into the course, as much as the knowledge that we're sort of creating within the AA and within other programs that obviously we're colleagues with. So, is there anything else pressing?
I see a lot of really provocative forms and kind of interesting, wondering how that might go together on a larger scale. And I guess I'm just kind of curious and a little lost on, or perhaps just questioning, have you done research on how these kind of more interesting and intricate forms might interface with the built environment that we can really only assume will be around for quite a while? And like I said, I mean, I respect so much the investigation in new materials, and in isolation they look like they could be, have high possibility and potential. But I'm just curious as to, like where are the front lines between these new materialities and what we have now, and how can we kind of use what we have now to perhaps, ignite a new form of materiality and form?
Yeah, I think maybe one thing that we should, let's say, be kind of open to is the fact that the building industry isn't the most forward-thinking of industries that we're working with, right? So we're still practicing kind of 100-year-old practices, and I'm not to suggest that those are not valid. It's to suggest that the reasons for that is something that we should actually question. I think things become habitual and in a way that allows a certain kind of comfort within that. I think the challenges that we have as architects is the fact that, yes, we are working at scales that really do have an amazing amount of impact. So for all the discussion of architecture and throwaway culture, the reality is that it's anything but. And so obviously I take the professional aspect and responsibility as something that's very important. That being said, I think we do have some examples. When I show people like Eladio Dieste, I find him to be one of the real role models for the things that we could be doing, which is also maybe one of those figures that could be important in terms of what we're going to do now, but from a different perspective, less about his structuring, his systems and so forth, more about the discovery of a certain kind of labor, their skill set, coupling certain forms of innovation with a certain form of practice. And I do think actually we can do a lot of stuff. I'm really not that interested in form as a given, because for good or for bad, I worked for some, I think, really good formal architects. and that was their project. And I think we sort of disrespect that kind of project quite quickly. But for any of those people that actually tried to make those buildings, the challenges for those things and the risk were amazing. And so for me, I learned a lot working for people like Eisenman or Zaha. I have a great deal of respect for the people in their office who are trying to really find better ways of doing that within a climate actually that we know doesn't have much tolerance. I'm not talking about tolerance for making, but I mean time. Like, how do you fast track a non-standard architecture at the scale of some of the things that are going on in China? Or, you know, like, it's an amazing problem. It's a problem that if we don't address it, you know, other people will do it anyway. If you really are clear about the role of the architect today, you'll realize that there are many building types that people don't really engage with. So let's say my interest in parametric urbanism was very much housing-based. Just an acknowledgement that a lot of these kind of large-scale housing proposals weren't really being looked at. And so, I mean, I don't know, the conversation is complex. The only thing that I would say, it's not simplistic. And first part of actually engaging it is acknowledging it. So I think in that sense, you know, the closer that we can get between, I think, materiality and computation and so forth, the better informed we will be of actually enabling some of this, not necessarily just to create different shapes, but just to, you know, work with different kinds of behaviors that will enable a different kind of sensibility of space and structure. And so, I mean, just because we operate within a given, let's call it construct, doesn't necessarily mean that that's so refined that it shouldn't be questioned. And so part of the active engagement, in particular with our students, is to have the faith in terms of proposing an alternative model. And some of those models actually really do have an influence. And I think that's the power, actually, of working in the way that we do, is the fact that practice also has so many constraints on them that they do look at what's going on in the different schools. They look at places like this. In London in particular, you know, I think schools like the AA, the Bartlett, Central St. Martin's for fashion and so forth, some of the most interesting work by far are being made by the students, not necessarily by the local offices or the young practices. And I think it's not to say that we should just look at students' work, because obviously those young offices are the ones teaching those students, but I think it's really important to really think about it as a community and what role can one do to foster the other. I mean, it's not like developing a car. We're really one-off in terms of design to build. And as much as people want to theorize it in different ways, the practice of architecture, even for the so-called most normative of buildings, is a task. And so that's why I think we can try to collectively engage that. I keep using these words collectively because I'm trying to be the broken record right now, and hopefully a couple of those words will sort of stick. And I think, you know, the fact that our students actually are really actively looked at by practice, I think is useful, because, you know, they're a student like any other student. They come into an environment. The only difference maybe is, you know, having people allowing them to pursue the things that they think are important. That doesn't necessarily mean do whatever the student says. It just means to drive them in a direction where they're faced with their own decision making. And that's not the easiest thing to do. And that's part, I think, of the learning process. There was a question.
Would you talk a little bit more to sort of the boundary between parametric and analog design in your process? And in particular, I was thinking of the urban design that you showed, and where do you exercise design control or for form or function?
Yeah, I think the discussion about form and function doesn't necessarily sort of always tease out the problem, right? And so I think, like, for example, like going back to Jason's point, the issue of how do you structure a discussion is an acknowledgement that there really is radical difference between forms of computational design before we even talk about the analog stuff. Like the analog stuff, we have a really strong culture of that because we have people like Dieste and Frei Otto and Gaudi and all of these people to give us a good suggestion. The reason that they have become so important and strangely enough almost a cliche is the fact that their work resides so much in the things that we want to do within the digital domain. We don't want to be limited by those sort of material constraints. And I do believe computation is the way around that, right? So that we don't become Bucky Fuller in a literal sense, but we can learn from that. When you talk about parametrics, you're talking about literally top-down control. And I think there are instances where that becomes an amazing resource. But I think, for example, people use the word parametric as a substitute for digital. I really don't think people are talking about parametric anything. And anybody who's opened up a piece of parametric software will realize that it's so not Maya and Rhino and Grasshopper in the literal sense. I mean, it really is on the other side of things, which is like really top-down, overly control, variation within a degree. And the reason for that is obviously to really try to explicitly engage with things like that. And so when you look at people like Frank Gehry and so forth, you know, people usually just either talk like he just sort of plays around with stuff or he just sort of panelizes stuff. But I mean, like, there is so much going on there that it would be our loss if we don't sort of engage in some of that. And he's just doing surfaces, which people don't really talk about anymore, right? Like, that's kind of old hat. So I just mean, like, there's so much complexity within that. We need those distinctions. We do a lot of generative design because we are trying to, I mean, personally, my attitude is very interaction-based, and it's also about trying to develop systems that have a kind of context specificity without being site-specific. And so when we look at agent-based design systems, when we look at actually thinking about robotics, I'm not really interested in the robotic arm. You know, we're interested in systems that are more about self-assembly. We're interested in more like swarm robotics, small, miniature, you know, looking at things like Rodney Brooks at MIT, which, you know, we had an office above the MIT Museum, and going downstairs and seeing the things that these guys were doing in the 60s and 70s, it's just mind-blowing. And to think that that stuff has just sort of moved only into a commercial market is a little bit of a radical change in terms of how culture sees innovation. So the most amazing animatronics is in Disney or in Hollywood. It's not in fabricating a house, because we're just basically making a large cake-making machine, right? Or like, that's as crude as we are. Not we, because we're not necessarily always developing the technologies, but I mean, where technology actually finds its force is not necessarily always the things that should be driving the way that we respond to things. And so I just think, like, we, as specific as we can be about having an informed conversation, the better. And I mean, the fact that you don't actually have to be a parametricist or an agent designer or whatever. I mean, you can use and exploit those things when necessary for the things that they do really well. And the more that we actually work through those problems, I think the better that we'll be able to ask more, let's say, better questions about what it is that we're doing. So we're still scratching the surface, and I think that there's a lot of novelty in it. But I do think that there's a serious project there if people allow that to sort of happen. Like, let's say I'm all in. I don't actually wonder or stay up at night about that. I think architecture matters. I want to enable it with what I could use. I think that there's an amazing amount of resources out there if you're open and curious to actually exploit them. Frank is a good example. I mean, he did reach out to CATIA. Everybody will say, like, get a sponsor or talk to a particular industry, but it's a very different thing if you're invested in actually working with them to develop things, and you have to have the commitment for that, and I would just only encourage you to do that.
Just your practice on exploring the shifting role of the architect from the positive space of enclosure to the negative space of curating experience or the evolution of programs, such as in libraries, museums, schools, etc.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I would say this, we're not usually very program specific with a lot of the things that we've been doing recently with Proto Design systems and so forth. I think that's part of the critique that I have at the moment of the work that we've been doing. We've focused in a highly specialized way in a certain kind of category of development, And I think that's why we're trying to rethink what the social means. And the social actually also implies different forms of building type. Like, for example, a library today could be a very open question about what that actually means, how that is facilitated, what actually operates there. Is it a new public space or is it something else? So I think like those kind of questions are really open for interrogation. Like the things that I do with my brother, I think in some sense are moving towards that, and slowly we're moving towards architecture. I say that because, I mean, it's not like architecture just came to us. It's something that we've been sort of fostering for a while, and the more that we get a better sense of how we can actually work and enable people and participation, I think the more then we can challenge the difference between what an interior and an exterior is, or what the basic conventions of what predefines architecture in a normative sense could be. Because when you look at people like Negroponte, I mean, he's a guy who sells laptops now, right? That's what he's known for. When you think about his sensibility, his track dematerialized architecture and went into something else. He's still an architect. I think his sensibility of space has changed. He's talking about basically enabling Wi-Fi systems, giving students in different kinds of remote areas access to information and different forms of knowledge. I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to move down that track. I'm just suggesting that here was an architect whose project led him to something that one would consider not architectural. But if you're invested long enough in it, you see that the way that one sees through architecture, or the education of an architect, and the reintroduction of spatiality, I think, is a critical one. For sure within a lot of discourse, but I think much more engaged in terms of what it means to actually develop an environment, in particular a built environment. Have I completely killed everybody? Okay, thank you very much for having me.